Hi, my name is Danica and today I have a video that I've been wanting to make for about 6 months. So you may know that at the end of 2014 I decided I wanted to diversify my reading and really prioritize authors of color, so I decided to make 2015 my year of reading in color and read pretty much no white authors. I'll link to the video where I discuss this down below, but I wanted to talk about some of the difficulties and questions that have come up while I've been diversifying my reading. I've been a bit nervous about making this video because I really don't want it to come across as like this is too hard, so don't bother doing it. But it's a discussion I'd really like to see on BookTube, so I thought I would talk about some of the questions that have come up as I've been adding more authors of color into my reading. So basically when I looked over the books that I had read in 2014, I realized that the vast majority of the authors that I was reading were white. And I wanted to change that, obviously, but the first question that I grappled with was, well, what do I want this to look like? What would my ideal ratio look like? Am I aiming to represent the population of the country I live in, or the population of the world, or a completely different number? Do I want it to be 25%, 50%, 3/4? I don't think there's any one right answer for that. For me, I wanted to go 100% authors of color for a year to really shake up my reading habits, and I thought that way I could more naturally incorporate more authors of color now that I had kind of dipped my toes in and found some new authors and found new recommendations to go from. As I've been doing this for a little while, I think that now I'd like to have it be about 50-50. Would rather not have more than 50% of the authors I'm reading be white. The sort of messy, uncomfortable part is, what counts as a diverse read? If you're trying to put a ratio on authors of color versus white authors, what do you mean by an author of color and what do you mean by white? Who counts? The easy answer to this is it's how people self-identify, and that's great, except that if you look at authors' websites, if they even have a website, they usually don't list the race that they identify as. So yes, definitely, self-identification is totally preferable if you can find that information. So basically I found out as I'm trying to incorporate more authors of color that there's sort of two main ways to do this. One is to get your book recommendations from diverse sources, and that's the easiest way, I think, if you follow more blogs that talk about African authors, or blogs like Diversity in YA that really prioritize diverse books, and then it's really easy to incorporate it and you don't really have to ask that question. But the other strategy is to look through the books that you're already interested in or you already own or on a list and prioritize the authors of color that are in there. I keep lots of ridiculously long lists, lots of them over 1,000 books long, so that was one of the things that I did, which required Googling hundreds of authors that I wasn't familiar with. Occasionally they would have biographies that would talk about how they self-identified, but I'm going to be 100% honest, because that was the point of this video, and say that a lot of the time I would be Googling and just find a picture of them and then try to look at them and decide whether they're white or not. So I'm just gonna lay my cards on the table and admit that I did that. And I don't really know what else you can do, as messed up as that felt. If you really want to drive home just how constructed the idea of race is, Google hundreds of strangers and try to decide what their race is, because it was so awkward. And so much of the time I was like, I don't even know, what even are these categories anymore? Like, what does that even mean? I still think it's worth it to prioritize authors of color, even if that's not the easiest information to get in the first place. And because race is constructed and it doesn't have these finite, neat categorizations, you end up having to have a definition of what you mean by person of color and white. And even the term people of color is just blatantly wrong, because that's a political term, mostly for people in the US. It is not meant to be used globally. It's definitely not meant to be used for like a Chinese person in China, but I can't find a better word to use. I don't want to say non-white, so I've been using that even though I know it's not accurate. Some of the questions that come up when you're trying to do this is, do Jewish people count? What if they're, 1/8 Chinese? Does that count? What about 1/4? Do Isabel Allende and Gabriel Garcia Marquez count? I felt ridiculous. I still feel ridiculous trying to come up with an answer for that, because I'm white, what do I know? And it seems so silly to have to draw these distinctions. That's not the point. All of those questions, again, if that's how people self-identify, I'm definitely going to take that over anything else. Then there's the issue of, well, if it's authors of color who are writing about white people, does that count? And what about the reverse? If white people are writing characters of color, is that a diverse read? What do you want to prioritize? Do you want to prioritize works in translation? Are you trying to get like a good variety of countries that you're reading from? Are you trying to read about the experiences of minorities in your own country? Do you watch the different ratios of races being represented, or is it just the two categories of white and non-white? And these have all been questions that have come up while I was researching this Year of Reading in Color project and while I've been doing it, and they feel really uncomfortable. But I think that if you are going to be doing this as well, if you're trying to diversify your reading, they might come up for you as well. So for me, what it came down to was to not stress about absolutes, to not worry about having a hard and fast definition, and to not worry so much about having exact numbers. I don't need to interrogate every book I read about whether it really counts as diverse. I think when you're first examining your reading habits, it can be really useful to get a number and to really look at, oh, 85% of my reading is by white people and 90% of it is straight, and 65% of it is by men. Like, those are all numbers that make you really realize what your reading looks like, and those can be super useful as a starting point. But now I'm at the point where I think I can track general trends without having to have exact numbers and without having to slot people into little categories, which I think has also been me thinking about. Annie from One Small Paw has made a Tumblr post and a YouTube video. I'll link those as well. And I think those make really good points about not trying to boil people down to one category. I've already been doing this with queer books. Before this, I usually have read about 50% queer books, but I never really tracked it. It just happened fairly naturally that I would pick up a straight book and then probably pick up a queer book after that. I think that in the future I'll probably be doing the same thing with authors of color and white authors, just making sure that I'm not reading a lot of white authors in a row, and if I do, to just switch it up. I don't think you need to really worry about, does this really count, as long as the general trend of your reading is changing. And again, I don't want this video to come off as it's too complicated, it's too difficult. I will link down below. Book Riot did a great series of Reading Diversely FAQs that address some of the general questions that you can have while you're diversifying your reading, and that's a super useful resource. But I was also thinking about, like, if somebody says, I want to be more healthy, when you do that, you have to define, what do I mean by healthy? And you end up having to ask questions that are like, is watermelon healthy or is that a treat? And is heavy cleaning count as exercise? And those are kind of silly, minute questions, but nobody says, well, that just seems way too difficult to define. You're better off just not thinking about it at all. I mean, some people do, but mostly people don't, because they know that even though it may be tricky to figure out exactly how you're going to go about it, it still is a worthwhile goal. I think it's the same thing with how we consume media. It might be messy and uncomfortable to change your habits, and it might be hard to start paying attention to things and asking difficult questions, but I still think it's worth it. So let me know, have you had any messy, uncomfortable questions while diversifying your reading, and how did you handle those? Please feel free to correct me if I've said anything wrong. I'm still really learning, so let's have some uncomfortable conversations, and thank you for watching. Bye!